All right, you guys, so I'm going to try, now that we're getting to the pelvis and the trunk and stuff, I'm going to try to not put on the screen. You already have the stuff, and you can look at it there. I don't have to have a redundancy here, and I'm hoping that the video will have more of me doing the examples and the motions. That way, if you go back and reference it, it'll be easier to see, okay? What I want to do is kind of make sure we're on the same page before we transition to illustrative hip and pelvic girdle rotations. So one of the things that I try to keep things as simple as possible. So for the hip, when we have these, this triaxial ball and socket, a lot of different motions, a lot of different things going on, I like to say, well, what do we know already? What do we kind of have that we've been introduced to before? Where's the similarities before we go into differences? The biggest similarity to what we've had before, I have my little Kindle here to represent the head of the femur and eventually the head of the humerus. But we have the fetal, and not a fetal, right? The flexion, the extension. We have that before, getting into a ball, getting out of the ball. We also, from the knee, trying to make sure I get it up here, but we have, hey, left knee, spin laterally, external rotation. We have that precedent. So it would be the same. Hey, left hip, spin laterally, spin externally. Okay. The only one we haven't had yet is the frontal plane. I wanted to give you guys, again, purpose. Frontal plane motion of the ball and sockets has a little bit in common to do with sagittal plane. Different planes. But if you think of when we were in elementary school and you had to pick, well, for us, where I'm from, it's like junior high, but when you were in elementary school, when you had to pick like which one doesn't belong, apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer, right? Remember? I dominated that in junior high. I was so good at that game. Which one doesn't belong? Sagittal, frontal, transverse. Like which one is different? The transverse, right? The sagittal and the frontal have something in common. It may not be the exact same planes, but I know that it would be, I say just as hard, but a heck of a lot harder to lift my 20-pound dumbbells here or there versus like this. Right? Okay? So there's similarities. There's something similar with the sagittal plane and the frontal plane. That similarity is sagittal gets you to fetal, right? Gets you more to fetal. But who's to say there can't be a combination of roads that also get you into fetal? So I'm going to use this shoulder example because the hip doesn't have the motion that we do in the shoulder. But check this out. If I did flexion into fetal, Ken is upside down, but his face is still facing in, right? If I go frontal plane, it's kind of similar. I'm trying to get his feet up. I got to do a little spinny spin, but I get to the same place. So my point is, ab and adduction are sometimes referred to as lateral flexion. We're not going to call it in this class, but if you think about it, it's kind of similar. I'm just getting up into a fetal position, just in a different road. And if you go, let's say using the road analogy, if you go to Opelousas through the flexion road, you can still get there, but you may have to go like there and then here, right? So it's not the exact same road, but it'll get you to the same place. So ab and adduction is a version of lateral flexion, trying to eventually get me, I mean, think about it, like you could do, heads up, you could do this, or you could do this, like it gets you to the same place, okay? So, I don't know if Miriam and Sarah emphasize this, but I'm gonna emphasize it a lot. One of the biggest traps that students face with ab and adduction is just how similar sounding those words are. Flexion, extension. internal, external, medial, lateral, ab, ad. It's ridiculous. I don't know who named that, Satan or something, but they're so similar sounding that students miss it. Not because maybe they don't know what they mean. It's because ab and adduction sound and look ridiculously close. I'm dyslexic. They look the same to me. So what I try to do, knowing that issue, is I'll say things in class like AB or AD, or I'll say things like and add to emphasize the one little letter difference that happens to be a miracle. Okay? The analogy I'll give sometimes is in school, small school, but we had these twins and they were, I forget the difference. Fraternal means the egg didn't split, right? They don't necessarily look the same, they're not identical. Okay. So they were not identical. But their names were Keith and Keith. So unless you knew them well, people would switch their names all the time. But it's not that they look the same. Like, it's not like two twins that look identical when you keep missing them. They didn't look alike at all. But you would flip their names because their names sounded familiar. So that's how ab and ad are. Just warning you, I'm telling you. Okay? So for our hip and eventually our shoulder, because they follow the same rules, we're going to have flexion gets you. These are all, it looks like it's moving and it is. These are the ones I know you've been introduced to before. My job is to take you further to the illusions. Left hip flexion from anatomical, left hip extension to anatomical, left hip extension from anatomical. Left hip flexion to, left hip flexion from. Okay? Left hip abduction from, left hip adduction to. Now we get to a really interesting place where our thorax becomes kind of an endpoint for motion. Like, I can't adduct my shoulder anymore because literally this tissue is smacking up against this tissue. But if my body was to magically disappear, I could go a little further in. That makes sense? Like, I could have adduction from. I'm telling you that because in anatomical position, we may kind of eventually hit something, but if this wasn't in the way, I could go a little bit further. And we're going to see that when we start moving the sockets over the ball, where I can be in anatomical position and have a big chunk of left hip adduction from anatomical position, because there's nothing getting in the way of the sockets going here. Okay, so I'm just planting that seed. So we have flexion and extension. Looks like it's moving and it's not. It looks like it's not moving, but it is, would look like this. Flexion, extension. That was first test stuff, right? Flexion from, extension to, specifically left hip. Now let's go frontal plane. It looks like it's moving, and it is. Left hip ab, left hip ad, Your brain wants to establish a global reference of spin. Don't do it. Just because the femur spins this way for ab, when the socket moves, it's actually going to spin the other way for ab. And we've done that tons of times. The Coke in bottle and cap in the bottle. So left hip ab looks like it's moving, and it is. Left hip ab, it looks like it didn't move, but it did. It's 4 types of motion. One of them is ridiculously easy. It looks like it's not moving, and it's not. All day, right? So I don't go over that 4th one. But the 3 others, looks like it's moving, and it is. Hopefully y'all make those 2-foot putts. And then the 2 illusions. It doesn't look like it's moving traditionally, but it is.
where it looks like it's moving traditionally, but it is not.
This one did not move. This one did. This one is still in anatomical position. I could be in a cast where I couldn't move my hip if I tried and still do this motion. Just go along for the ride. Does that make sense? My shoulder could be at 90 degrees and I could bend my trunk and my hand goes up, but my shoulder didn't move. It went along for the ride. But your instinct is hand goes up, must be this. Arm goes down, must be that. And that's, to me, the art of teaching, is that I'm trying to show you that just because my hand went down didn't mean I abducted my shoulder. Just because my hand went up didn't mean I abducted my shoulder. Yes? Just because my leg didn't move doesn't mean I didn't ab or abduct my hips. Because it's the relative change of the bones that articulate the joint itself. And these bones and these joints care zero with the ceiling or the floor, or the walls, or the front or the back. They don't care. So therefore, we should not care. We should not adhere to ups and downs and fronts and backs and lefts and rights to learn human movement. That's where we're going to make mistakes. Okay? Any questions about the illusions of hip motion? So if I did this left hip ab, do you see it? If you can't see it, turn your head. What I like to say is the pelvis is never lost. You can always reposition in your packet. I have like the penguin in the pelvis. They have this pelvis picture, and my youngest son loves penguin. He's 14 years old, dude loves penguin. And so I drew a little penguin. So it's like the penguin in the pelvis is never lost. So if my pelvis tilts here, all you got to do is tilt your head to look at it from anatomical, and you should be able to see how the hip is deviated frontally or sagittally or. So, for instance, if you get it, great. This is my last attempt for those that I'm still not there. If I do this, don't pay attention to this one. I'm just old. I can't balance like I used to. If you tilt your right ear to your right shoulder and look at my pelvis as if the pelvis was neutral or an anatomical, you should be able to see how my left hip is deviated in the lateral flexion. It's abducted relative to where it was when it was here. Left hip abduction. Left hip adduction, coming back. Middle class. Go left, right ear, right shoulder. Look at the pelvis as if the pelvis is never lost, and you can see how the left hip is deviated. Abductally. Make that word up. Okay? Abducted. So like, here's anatomical. Here's the socket's perspective, and so the femur did this. This is the same as this. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's go the other way. Don't do this at home. Cut my circle. That's how we do it in double. Think. If I go here, this was left hip ab. So what if I do this? It's just going the other direction, same road. But I started here, and instead of doing this, I went here. Can you see how my left hip adducted? Start. Here you would want to go left ear, left shoulder to see the pelvis in its anatomical, and you can see how the hip is adducted.
It's adducted relative to where it was. See it? Make sure I'm getting the, so we started here for the first one, and I've tried to explain that this is the same as this. And now we did the adduction, that this is adducted. So in other words, if I brought it back to anatomical, I'm going to try to do this. I feel like I'm teaching for the first time. It's been a while. Let's see if I can do this, guys. This is the exact same as freeze rage. That. Same thing. So therefore, this would be the same as this. I just have to get my leg out of the way. Does that make sense? That's why I can travel down that road, because this isn't getting in the way of the motion as if I did it like this. Yes? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so because the right side of the pelvis can't move independently of each other, when you add up one side of your hip, does the other side automatically add up?
It doesn't have to.
It doesn't have to.
However, there are situations where it has to. I'm going to give you an example of each. When both feet are on the ground, so the question was, because the pelvis is linked, the sockets are connected, if you move one hip, do you have to move the other? Okay. So the first one is, if I don't move the sockets, I could independently, right, no problem. But I can also independently move them if I get my foot off of the ground, right? So like when I do a motion like this, my right leg is off the ground, so I can independently, does that make sense? Now, my pelvis is dependent on the one that's on the ground. So in other words, my left hip is going to be the reason that I come back to the ground, right? It's almost like if you take a child and pick them up off the ground and they're like swinging, playing, they're not going to get down until you put them down, right? And so it's very similar. Once this leg is off the ground, then this hip has zero to do with my pelvic girdle rotation until this one loads at that. In the case of, there is one where they do have to move, and that is if both feet are on the ground and I have hip motion. Well, in this case, unless I'm on roller skates and it will roll around, right? Here, both of the hips have to move. It'd be impossible to just move one or the other. Because if I try to move my left hip adduction, I would have to drive this leg into the ground for it to not move. What a great question. Does that make sense? And trust me, we're going to practice a lot. We're going to practice a lot, okay? So what we've done is we've done one at a time. Left hip, ab. Left hip, add. Left hip, add. Left hip, ab. That's the weird one. Because we can't, I say we can't, we don't get a lot of adduction from anatomical when it looks like it's moving and it's not. So our brains really rarely hear adduction to anatomical. We rarely hear that. But it happens when we do stuff like this. That was adduction from, so this would be abduction to. Abduction from, adduction to. In fact, when you're studying tonight, you can feel when you may have to abduct a little bit more, but when you do this, you feel the stretch on the inside of your leg. It's because you're stretching the adduction pulling muscles because you're abducting your hip. Just like you'd be feeling your extension pulling hamstrings when you flex your hips. Same concept, just in a different plane. Okay. So let's do a couple where both feet are on the ground. Now, both feet are on the ground. Left hip add, right hip ab. They have to be opposite in this case. Sagittal, they don't have to be opposite. Bilateral flexion, bilateral extension. But in frontal, if I were going to have bilateral abduction, the friction from the ground is preventing my feet from flying. I'd have to jump up off the ground in order to do that. Does that make sense? So from here, we have to move ipsilateral. We have to go in opposition. Because again, if you try to bilaterally abduct, your feet can't move. True? So in other words, don't assume. Just because we can bilaterally flex, and just because we can bilaterally extend, doesn't mean when our feet are on the ground, we can bilaterally ab and abduct. Cool? Go this way for the camera. This way, left hip add, right hip ab. So this would be left hip add from anatomical, right hip ab from anatomical. Coming back, left hip ab to anatomical, right hip add to anatomical. From, to. That's what they call walking a reverse pendulum. Because like, you know what a grandfather clock is? So like you imagine like the pendulum swinging on a clock. Well, if this is down, you'd have to swing the clock about the pendulum. So that's what that is that when you're walking, you swing the clock pendulum, but then eventually to make the clock move, you got to fix the pendulum and move the clock. Then you move the pendulum again, then you move the clock again. You move the pendulum again, and you move the clock.
So you asked us to focus on really the only option that was left was like the opposite of it, so like it was already adducted, you have to be adducted back in time.
If the hip is adducted,
Yes.
well, if my hip is adducted, so let me try to simulate your question and make sure we're on the same page. So if I was here, okay, are you asking me, is the only way I can move is adduction, back to anatomical? And I'm going to say no, I don't have to. It'd be the easiest, but I could do something like this. I could do something like this. So I'm not going to ask that on the test, but anytime someone says, do you have to, it always triggers my mind to say, are you more likely to? Absolutely. But do you have to? It actually goes back to this point. To go into fetal, do you have to flex? Make sense? I'm not going to ask that on the test, but when I had to, that my ethics and mechanics had to answer to say most likely, but you don't necessarily have to. You still have to travel down roads that will eventually get you there, but it doesn't have to be that exact road. Good. All right. Are we cool with frontal? Ab and ad? Right. Let's go with external and internal. Remember, left knee spin laterally. It's a mirror effect. Is everybody cool with the mirror effect? The reason I like to use the mirror effect is because for your brains, it's super weird. And look, your brains, my brain too, this is weird. We're always taught clockwise, counterclockwise, but yet I have two motions. One's clockwise, one's counter. Like they're two opposite spins. But they're not. They're the same spin relative to the joints itself. I love the double door analogy. I love it. Because both doors spin in opposite ways, right? But they both open it. They both close it. So if that's tough for you to visualize, just do one knee or eventually hip and say, if I was doing this motion in a mirror, and I spun that one leg a certain way, wouldn't the appendage in the mirror do this? Because it's to show you that those are the same motions. Because these are mirrors of each other. Okay? So for the hip, hey, left hip, spin laterally. It looks like it's moving, and it is. All of our lefty-loosey, righty-tighties, the reason those got their names is because the small cat will 99% of the time move about the bigger bottle. When you're turning on or off a hose nozzle, the smaller piece always moves about the bigger piece. So we name these motions as if the majority of the time, the smaller piece is going to move about the bigger piece. Problem is, in human movement, the bigger piece can move about the smaller piece, and it looks different globally, but it is the exact same locally. So, left hip, spin laterally. That's left hip external or lateral rotation. We'll do the mirror effect. If this hip spins laterally this way, well, guess what? This hip is going to spin laterally that way. Like a Backstreet Boy. This is where our brains have a tough time letting go. I was the same way. Left hip, spin laterally. What would it look like if the ball stayed still and the socket moved? It would look like this. Left hip, spin laterally. And that's weird for us. It's weird to know that when a right-handed batter does this, this is internal rotation on my left hip. That's freaky to us because we want anything that spins this way to be lateral. If this was lateral, why wouldn't this be lateral? Because it's not. Hey, left hip, you got out of anatomical. Yes, sir. Go back home if you don't mind. Sure. All I have to do is externally rotate to go back home. Ah, so that meant you had to internally rotate when you left. That is true. Start. Finish. The hip has to externally rotate to go back to where he started. That should show you that the hip had to internally rotate when he left. Make sense? Left hip, external. Right hip, external. Left hip, external. Right hip, external. Let me try it a different way. Left hip, external. Freeze rage. Getting old. This is where I'm at now. Did that make sense? Let me try it again. From here to there, I'm trying to make it simple. From here to there is literally this. Here to there. Left hip internally rotate. Left hip internally rotate. It's the knee illusion. External, external. When we spend all that time trying to see that illusion, it's the same illusion. Internal, internal. External, external. Here's another way to look at it. External, no problem, right? How would I go back to anatomical if I wanted to move the socket? Not like this. To go back home, wouldn't I have to do this? It's left hip internal rotation. The same as This is left hip internal. It looks weird when we put them together. I try to separate them. Right hip external, right hip internal. Left hip external, left hip internal. But when both feet are on the ground, I can't bilaterally internal and external because friction. In other words, for me to have bilateral external and internal, I have to get off the ground. But if you try to do it like this, friction's preventing that mirror effect, right? So when you move the sockets, your only option is to have opposite motions of the hips. Just like we had opposite motions of the hips in the front. So in other words, when I'm here and I move the sockets of both, my left hip internally rotated and my right hip externally rotated. So that would look like left hip internal, right hip external. Left hip external, right hip internal. Is that a lot? Do me a favor. Rise. Let's get up. Let's get up. All right, guys, first of all, use your desk to balance if you need. Stand on your right leg, okay? Right leg. And what I would like for you to do, I'm going to mirror you guys so that way we're all on the same page. Stand on your right leg. And what I would like for you to do is rotate your pelvis. Now, your pelvis has the sockets in it, right? So rotate your sockets where now your pelvis is looking at the left side of the room, but keep your foot on the ground so that your toes are pointing to the chalkboard. Your right hip externally rotated. Do you see how those toes are pointing laterally to the front of the penguin? Does that make sense? Okay, come back. Let's take a ride on the left side. Rotate your pelvis so that you're looking at that wall. Your left hip externally rotated. Cool? All right, let's go back. Let's do this one more time. We're going to do it in a different style. We're going to do it in salsa. No, I'm joking. Let's see. Right leg. Look here. Your right hip externally rotated. Now, what I'd like you to do is say, all right, I'm not going to move my pelvis. I'm not going to move my sockets. Hey, right hip, come off of the ground and spin to go back home. Would you have to internally rotate your hip to go back? You know why? Because you had to externally rotate when you left. That makes sense? Let's do it the other side. Start. Left hip, external rotation. Take that left hip off the ground and say, hey, left hip, spin to go back and meet your brothers and sisters and cousins. Would you have to internally rotate to go back home? Because you had to externally rotate when you left home. Cool? All right, before you sit down, one more. Both feet on the ground. Rotate your pelvis to its right. Spin to your right, but both feet are still facing forward. Your right hip should be internally rotated, and your left hip should be externally rotated. Spin your pelvis back to the left, to the other side. Now your left hip should be internally rotated, and your right hip should be externally rotated. Yes? Okay. I know this is awkward to stand during class. Here's another way of looking at what I try to do. Okay? We analyze motion joint by joint, but we can also do it for the same joint plane by plane. So what I mean by that is, if my left hip is externally rotated, it doesn't change that fact if I flex it. You see what I did there? I'm externally rotated, I'm externally rotated. So watch this trick that I'm going to try to show you to prove you the spin, the rotation. Here to there, internally, externally. Internal, external. I'm going to try to bring my hips back as much to anatomical as I can except for the spin. So watch what's going to happen. Hey, hips, go back home. So hips, where were you? Trying to do it for you guys. I'm home. Not home anymore. Not home anymore. External, internal. So that meant when I left home, I had that internal external. When I started here, I did this. I'm showing you how to go back home like this, I had to do that. Just looks different. Yes? Any questions? Did they discuss pelvic girdle rotations with y'all like I asked them to do? Introduced to it? Okay. The key thing about pelvic girdle rotations, I'm going to try to do an analogy here, and why it's important for us as young adults and adults who invest in their education in kinesiology. I'm trying to give you your money's worth. The reason that what we're about to discuss is important is so that you guys can see and understand that when somebody's doing, let's say like a sit-up, and ideally, even though you don't have to do them optimally, you want someone to hold your feet down, right? Like if you want to do as many as you can, you want someone to hold your feet. And that's because your hip motion, you can't go all the way up by just moving your trunk. It's a crunch, right? Your hip motion has to be supplied, the pelvis motion has to be supplied by the hips. In fact, after you do a bunch of sit-ups, your hip muscles feel like, I feel that here. But when you do a reverse crunch, your feet are off the ground. You have the same pelvic spin, but now it's not about hip muscles, it's about tummy muscles. Trunk motion. That's why they call this a crunch and this is a reverse crunch, and that's why they call me an old man, because I'm shaking, just doing a couple crunches. So the point is, the pelvis is super unique in that it can be influenced from the top and or from the bottom. And in fact, the pelvis can be influenced by just your right hip motion. My penguin's getting all dizzy. Just my left hip motion. Both hips, or no hips at all. Trunk. When you do me this favor, if you could hold on to your desk and swivel your chair, but try to keep your sternum facing forward. It's like swivel this way or swivel that way. That had nothing to do with your hips. That was your trunk. In fact, if you go far, you can feel the stretch in your trunk. Now, that's because your trunk twisted. Okay? So it's important for us to differentiate the pelvic spin, because a lot of problems that you guys are eventually going to be working with involves this stuff, core. And one of the reasons it's hard for some people to help people that have problems here is because this is the part of the body that's unexposed. It's hidden. There's nowhere to hide over here. Give you an analogy. Baseball season's about to start, right? Anybody excited about that? Yay. Any fans or players of softball? Softball. When I was, it's my last story. I'm a storyteller to try to get up emphasis. So I was a baseball player. not a good one. I just tried to make contact and run as fast as I could at first base. And I was a left-handed pitcher, topped out at 75 miles an hour. Every pitch was a changeup. But I love baseball. In college, as an athletic trainer, I worked women's volleyball. And then the softball trainer left and quit. And so they said, Brian, we're in a bind, no problem. It was a new world for me. And the girls, they were so fun to work with. But that's where, in my biomechanical mind, I learned how, for a few reasons why it's so tough to hit softball. One, for baseball guys, we're used to things coming top to bottom. But for softball, they're throwing it low, and we're not used to those. We're not used to anticipating data. We don't have the data processing to see a ball mid-flight and predict where it's going to be. But more than that, when I was throwing 75 miles an hour, there's no hiding the ball out here. Your peripherals, your appendages are out in the open. But when Melissa Cundiff was like, hey, Brian, you want to take a couple cuts? Yeah, sure, Mel, no problem. What was that? Melissa's throwing, and it just pops out of existence. It's like a particle in particle physics. Like, whoa, where'd that come from? It wasn't exposed out where it couldn't hide. It was coming from somewhere in here. In other words, that ball was kind of hidden in the body, closer to the body. The point is, it's harder to see things that are in here versus out here. But just because it's harder doesn't mean it's not important. How many of you have ever heard of Dr. James Andrews, the famous orthopedic surgeon? Andrews? So Andrews was at the Houston clinic, which was an orthopedic clinic, and I was at Auburn, and I got to meet Dr. Andrews. The story of Andrews is he was willing to work with shoulders back in the day when nobody wanted to touch a shoulder. Like, give me all the shoulders. That's how you learn. You got dirty, made some mistakes, and became the greatest shoulder surgeon in the world. So what I'm trying to say, guys, is that the stuff that we're about to go through, pelvic girdle rotations because of hip, pelvic girdle rotation because of trunk, it's a little bit more complex than just this stuff. But it's what will make you on another level of clinician by understanding the things that are not as easy to see as this. Just because it's difficult doesn't mean it won't be worth it. But I'm explaining why it's harder to see things that are kind of hidden in the clothing, hidden in the center. Make sense? I'm going to teach you. I'm going to teach you how to look for clues. There's clues in the clothing, as you're going to hear me say. So in other words, when I rotate my pelvis and my trunk doesn't twist versus twisting my trunk, look at the difference. You're going to see the clues in the clothing that I'm going to teach you to look for. You're going to look at landmarks that I'm going to teach you to look at. But these landmarks will not be ceiling floor. These landmarks will be chin, chest. These landmarks will be sternum, pubis, or hip. There'll be local landmarks that have a 100% effective rate, not global landmarks. I have no problem with landmarks as long as they're within the body, not outside. Cool? Any questions? Dismissed. Have a good weekend.